PlayStation 5 launched in late 2020 to huge demand that ultimately overwhelmed available supply for multiple years onwards, making the PS5 about as scarce as the dodo bird for the first half of its life. But now in 2024, the PS5 is finally readily available, as is already the new revision in the PlayStation 5 Slim, which, as you would expect, slims down the entire package, and that's mainly it. With the PS5 somehow approaching 4 years old, the question certainly begins to arise: is it still worth buying? And the answer right out of the gate is probably yes. Yes, of course it's worth buying, right? But it does depend on the individual and what you want, along with some extended factors to take into consideration. Do you make sure you get the newer Slim model? Do you opt for the model with or without a disk drive? Or do you maybe instead wait for the PS5 Pro, rumored to launch late 2024? These are the things I want to answer in this video, as well as taking a look at the PS5 in general and how it stands and stacks up already at the halfway point of its life cycle. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and if Sony is to continue their past trends of console releases, we will probably see a PlayStation 5 Pro sooner rather than later, with rumors currently pointing to a September 2024 release, with the console apparently having been in development since early 2022. Now, this is all speculation, and that's important to emphasize, but if it does happen, rumors are highlighting 8K gaming and potentially some tech that could act similarly to Nvidia's own DLSS, which these days is a huge performance boost for gaming PCs. But the problem is none of this is confirmed, and until we hit the fall of this year, we're not going to really know for sure. What we can do, however, is look at what Sony did with the PS4 and draw some conclusions based off their past trends. And doing so does make the PS5 Pro look very likely to come soon, as it would actually be a bit overdue. This console generation in general has been much slower than usual due to the initial delays in availability. So the PS4 coming out in 2013 and then the PS4 Pro already coming out in 2016 did set a timeline of about 3 years, which has come and gone for the PS5. We have, however, seen the PS5 Slim, which came out November 2023, still maintaining two variations of the console, one with a disc and one without, and I'll talk about which of those I would recommend momentarily. This actually did roughly match the 3-year timeline of the PS4 Slim coming out, but the changes here aren't really so significant. The console didn't receive any drastic design changes and is about 30% smaller. It has some additional USB ports. It also has a full terabyte of storage, which is nice because the original PS5 came with just over 800 gigs. I can personally attest to that being pretty annoying. We will go into the Slim versus the original PS5 a bit more, but first let's finish the PS5 Pro discussion and also talk about what you might be upgrading from, because a lot of you who don't have a PS5 probably do have a PS4. Personally, while I do think it's going to probably happen this year and probably be awesome, I don't think it's worth waiting for if you have the cash and just want to buy a console today. The PS5, or more specifically the PS5 Slim, which is the one you'll mostly find on store shelves now, is absolutely still worth purchasing for a multitude of reasons, even once the PS5 Pro does end up releasing. Why? The PS5 Slim is still going to be sold and won't be seeing any price reduction whatsoever. The PS5 Pro will just be more expensive, and probably by a decent margin. I think if you're a bit on the fence, it's probably worth waiting, and if you already have a PS5, maybe an OG one from 2020 like me, and for some reason want the Slim, definitely don't bother upgrading yet. It really isn't an upgrade anyways. Wait for the PS5 Pro in the very least, if you're desperate for a new system for some reason. Now, if you currently have a PS4 Pro, I think there's a decent argument to be made to wait for the PlayStation 5 Pro, and we are finally at the point where there is a decent amount of genuine next-gen console exclusives. This has been such a weird generation due to how few PS5s were being sold, so a lot of game developers opted to continue last-gen releases for years. This has had the unfortunate side effect of some major stagnation in genuine graphical improvements and innovation within the industry. If you've noticed that games don't actually look a whole lot better than they did 5, even 10 years ago, it's in part because they keep releasing these on hardware from 2013. While games do still look ridiculously good these days, and I mean they can only get so much better, having them still be sold on PS4 means there's going to be compromises made to the underlying technology. Games like God of War Ragnarok normally should have been a PS5 exclusive, but they weren't. While it still looks great, don't get me wrong, you do have to wonder how it would look if a PS4 release never happened in the first place. Still, this has left the PS4 being significantly more relevant than anyone would have expected over 3 years into the PS5's life. Even some of the top video games of 2023 were released on the older hardware, although we are seeing less and less of it, which makes this a pretty good point to jump on the PS5 train. I'd also be remiss not to mention Grand Theft Auto 6, which had its first trailer premiere on YouTube December 4th, 2023, and has since already amassed over 170 million views. An absurd number for any sort of trailer, never mind a video game one. And if you want to play it with what might end up being the best possible experience when it does launch in 2025, assuming no delays, and, you know, on console, the PS5 Pro is probably going to be the way to go. And if you've been waiting out on your older PS4 or even PS4 Pro, then I think this is the perfect year to take the plunge. If you're willing to spend more money on a Pro model of the PS5, then it probably is worth waiting for. But for the majority of us who don't really care too much about some extra frames and just want to play fun games now, I do believe the PS5 is absolutely worth buying. And of course, you're likely looking at that PS5 Slim, which I believe Slim isn't even the official name, but that's what people will call it because that's what they typically call it. In any case, the original can still seemingly be found for now, as old inventory remains in some retailers. Considering the Slim is smaller and about the same price, I would prefer to opt for that personally. The only reason to get the fat PS5 would be if you're looking at the refurbished or used market, or if for some reason there was a clearance deal or something similar from a retailer. It's worth noting that the PS5 actually does see small price reductions, or at least I saw some on Boxing Day, so if you want to save a little cash and probably get a game bundled in, it might be worth looking around and waiting for a sale, but don't expect to save much more than maybe $50, since these consoles are still in very high demand, even if inventory has seemingly caught up in most areas. It's also worth mentioning that assuming the PS5 Pro does come out later this year in the fall, there'll probably be an influx on eBay and other online marketplaces of old PS5s as people want to upgrade to the Pro, so that might be a way to score a better deal. And let's talk about the original PS5 or fat PS5 versus the Slim. As said, the Slim isn't much of an upgrade if you can even call it that, so there's no point of buying it if you've got the original. While the Slim being about 30% smaller and 24% lighter is significant, the console is still massive, just like the oversized router that is the original PS5. And when I say massive, I mean absolutely gigantic. It is insane. That original PS5 makes the original Xbox, PS4, PS3, and whatever other console you throw in look like a child's toy in comparison. It's so big that you may unironically have trouble fitting it in your entertainment unit, depending on what you have, so the Slim here is an appreciated change, even if there's no real drastic upgrades. The price for the disc drive version stayed the same at $500 US, but the digital-only edition actually saw an increase of $50 to bring it to $450 US, which makes it even less appealing than before. Now, I strongly recommend getting the console with a disc drive for a large multitude of reasons, but mainly because ultimately it's nice to have the option even if it is $50 more. For me personally, it was important due to PS4 backwards compatibility. Basically, the entire library of PS4 games is playable on PS5, and since I personally own most of my PS4 games on disc, having that disc drive is the only way to play those games. If you have your entire PS4 library bought through Sony's store, then it might not be necessary. Although I would still make an argument for having physical media, given the worrying trends in the industry we've seen moving towards users never actually owning games anymore. The PlayStation Store is probably pretty reliable, and it's unlikely Sony would ever lock you out of games you've purchased, but it is something that could technically happen, so just keep it in mind. Let's just hope that Ubisoft never gets their way. Notably though, Sony is now offering a detachable disc drive, which is solely compatible with the Slim Digital Edition, not the original Digital Edition. It's $80, and I mean, it's nice for those who do, change their mind and want a disc drive later on, and it clicks into the console nicely and everything, but why even buy the discless version in the first place if this is something you'd be looking at? Again, I'm glad this is available, but I think the disc drive edition just makes way more sense for nearly anyone. Oh, and there's also the PlayStation Portal. I don't have much to say here, aside from the fact that this isn't in any way a standalone machine. All it does is stream from your PS5, which you already need to own, so if you want a way to play portably, assuming you've got a steady internet connection on both ends, it might appeal to you, but at $200 I would personally pass on it, especially since you can stream from your phone or your computer so easily and then use your Dualsense controller with that. Also, Nintendo is probably launching a Switch 2 later in 2024 as well, good chance around the same time as the PS5 Pro comes out. Now, the Switch does generally appeal to a different audience, but if it is something you're interested in, I would expect that $200 for a Portal to be much better spent in part on the new Nintendo machine, especially since it'll be its own standalone console without any streaming required. Even just get a Switch Lite, which is also $200 and, can actually play the games by itself without internet. Not to put down anyone who buys a Portal or wants to, I do certainly see the appeal, and remember remote playing my PS4 from my Vita back in the day just thinking it was the coolest thing ever. But do be aware, there are more options than ever for streaming these days, and $200 is a pretty penny for what is literally just a tablet with two halves of a controller slapped onto it. Aside from the Portal, the main accessory that PS5 users might be interested in is the PlayStation VR 2 headset, which released only February 2023. I'm not going to go too in depth here because I don't own one, and it's actually more expensive than the console itself, costing $550 American dollars. That's $50 more than the disc drive PS5 Slim. Definitely something to consider if you're into VR though, and it's gotten some pretty solid reviews, with games like Gran Turismo 7 really being the system sellers. Okay, so we've already covered quite a lot of ground. The PlayStation 5 Pro is probably, maybe, possibly coming around September 2024. The PS5 Slim is out and will remain around, making the PS5 Pro worth waiting for if you would normally want to buy a Pro model, but the current model is still more than worth it right now if you just want to get your hands on the amazing games that have released and continue to come out. And that's what it does really come down to with the PS5, the games. This is what probably makes it the best console to purchase today. I've got nothing against Xbox, I think it's great, don't get me wrong, but Microsoft has made the bold move to make their games accessible on Windows, and typically through Game Pass, even with streaming options, so it's not difficult to play their exclusives like Forza or the recent Starfield through different avenues. But when it comes to Sony exclusives, which have quite frankly mostly outshone Microsoft for the past decade, you only have one option, PlayStation, until those exclusives get ported over to PC later anyways. Not that that always happens. Bloodborne? One day. Now I should mention that Nintendo also has their own exclusives, and you'll find those only on Nintendo hardware, but that's a very different system with a different sort of appeal, and in my opinion, is probably worth buying alongside your PS5 if you can afford both, at least down the line. I will link in the description my video talking about the Switch in 2024, as well as my discussion on the Switch 2 if you're interested, so yeah, links below. As mentioned earlier, a lot of the games released in recent years have been developed for older consoles alongside the new generation, which leaves the PS5 with surprisingly few exclusives, and then some exclusives like Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart have already seen ports to Windows, something that should be expected for more Sony games down the road, but even so, Sony as a whole does bring a lot to the table when you look at the games having released before and since the PS5 launched, and even beyond that, this generation is finally starting to see more and more exclusives that don't cater to the older hardware, which I must really emphasize is crazy old at this point. The PS4 came out in 2013 and wasn't even particularly powerful back then, never mind now. The fact that games like Hogwarts Legacy have not only been ported over to that, but even the Switch is an absolute miracle. But the fact of the matter is, those games do absolutely look their best on the newest generation of hardware, and that applies to the vast majority of games where you'll see better graphics and better performance. While 60 FPS isn't always available for every game on PS5, it's common for big games these days to have performance mode options, so for games like Jedi Survivor or Spider-Man 2, just to name a couple, you can get stable, smooth 60 FPS gameplay that typically knocks down the resolution from around 4K to around 1080. Personally, I tend to jump between modes depending on the game. Spider-Man 2, I actually mainly played on fidelity mode at 30 FPS and 4K, as I really loved the cinematic feel and the ray traced reflections, but it's completely up to you and what you prefer, and just having any choice here at all is a really nice trend in recent gaming that should hopefully continue on consoles. I'm not going to go through the PS5's entire library, that's easy enough to look up, and it is pretty stacked at this point. The big thing is to just make sure that it's emphasized that games exclusive to this generation are going to become the norm, especially as of this year and beyond, making this again such a good time to jump on board and purchase a PS5 or even PS5 Pro down the line. Games for PS4, Xbox One, they're going to be less and less common. Plus, as mentioned, PS4 games are backwards compatible, which means you can play Bloodborne still locked to 30 FPS because FromSoft refuses to update it or give us a remaster, and it doesn't even matter because it's an absolute masterpiece and worth playing regardless. But also, please, FromSoft, give us a PC port or remaster or something, please. This is ridiculous. The SSD also makes these games just so much better to play. If you've been using a PS4 with its old hard drive for some of the newer titles in recent years, you are in for an absolute treat with the PS5. Some games practically don't have any loading times at all, and at most you're waiting a matter of seconds rather than sometimes a matter of minutes. You can also add an extra NVMe drive down the line if you'd like to. It's pretty easy to install, and I would recommend doing it if you're struggling for storage or, you know, download literally any Call of Duty game. I've still been managing fine with the original SSD in my PS5, but I do frequently delete and re-download games, which is absolutely a bit of a pain. If you want to play any games online, by the way, that aren't just free to play, you're going to need to look at PlayStation Plus, which has gotten very confusing since they changed how it works, but the base tier is titled Essential and offers free monthly games as long as you're subscribed, as well as the ability to play online multiplayer and have cloud saves. This all will cost you about $80 US per year. The other tiers are worth looking into if you want some more games playable at your every whim, but truthfully, the vast majority will only need PS Plus Essential. The Dualsense controller for PS5 is one of the greatest controllers ever made, and it does stand out from the competition thanks to the haptics and adaptive triggers. Astro's Playground comes with the PS5 and is a great little game you should definitely play when you get it. It perfectly shows off how cool these controllers can be, with the most wild, realistic haptics that are honestly hard to explain without trying for yourself. Things like skating on ice actually feels like you're skating on ice, and the triggers are adaptive, so they can become harder or easier to pull depending on the context. Unfortunately, most games don't properly utilize these features, so the ones that do add another level of immersion that you can't find anywhere on the same level except for PlayStation 5. And the DualSense controllers are also comfortable in the hand and probably the best controllers Sony's ever made, albeit battery life still isn't very good, so you're going to want to charge these pretty regularly after you're done playing. While I personally never had any drift issues like with the Switch Joy-Cons, I have had the issue of sticky buttons on my original PS5 controllers, something to note, but they're still perfectly usable and it's not that annoying. Overall, these have done quite well for me for the 3+ years I've had them for, and I really love these controllers. I also should mention that not only is there a Pro version of this controller called the Dualsense Edge, but also rumors of the normal controller receiving a V2 that would up the battery life significantly. A very nice improvement should it actually happen. This is a relatively recent rumor based on a Best Buy page that popped up, and I wouldn't worry about it too much, but it is worth noting all the same. Then of course you got the Dualsense Edge, which costs half the console itself at $200 US. That's obviously a heck of a ton of money, but Xbox has had a similar controller for years, and there was obviously demand for Sony to do the same. These come with swappable joysticks, remappable buttons, more adjustable options, profiles for what you prefer, and extra paddles, which can all be very convenient for certain games. I'm sure there's more features that I'm missing, but you get the idea. It's the Pro controller for the person who has the money to spend on it, and of course wants the best possible controller experience on their PlayStation 5. Definitely don't give it too much mind unless you've got a good chunk of expendable income sitting in your piggy bank. The regular DualSense doesn't have as many bells and whistles, but it does do the job, just so long as you keep it charged. And so with that, I don't think there's a whole lot else to talk about. The PlayStation 5 is currently the best Sony console available, and that alone is enough to make it worth buying. If you're the kind of person who would pay more money for the Pro model, it's probably worth waiting for the PS5 Pro to hopefully come out this fall. But if you don't want to wait, or would rather just pay less money to play the same games anyways, I don't think you'll go wrong picking up a PS5 today, especially now that we're looking at the Slim models. And whether it be the original, Slim, or eventual Pro, all the PS5s, again, are capable of playing the exact same games. And all in all here, in spite of the rough launch, at least in terms of stock, the PS5 has cemented itself as the gold standard for gaming in the current generation. It is absolutely worth buying if you can afford it, and I don't think you'll regret it whichever route you end up going. But now I want to hear from you. Do you own the PS5? Do you think it's worth buying, or should people wait for the PS5 Pro? Will FromSoft literally ever re-release Bloodborne, or is it stuck a PS4 exclusive for all eternity? Make sure you drop a comment below, and if you found this video helpful or interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more tech content. Thank you so much for watching. I am Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.